In the 9th century, when Baghdad glistened like a jewel at the heart of the Abbasid Empire, a boy was born in a smaller town called al-Hira. His name was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, and though he came into the world far from the great palaces and libraries of caliphs, his life would become inseparable from them. To understand his story, one must first imagine the world that awaited him. Baghdad in those days was not just a political capital. It was the meeting point of worlds. Caravans came from the east, carrying silks, spices, and precious stones. Ships docked in Basra and floated up the Tigris, heavy with goods from India and China. In the markets of the city, Arabic mixed with Persian, Greek, and Syriac, coins changed hands as easily as words. This wealth allowed the caliphs to dream beyond conquest and trade. They dreamed of knowledge, of gathering all the sciences of the ancient world, making them their own and extending them further. For that dream, they needed translators, men who could move wisdom from one language to another without losing its soul. Hunayn was destined to become the most gifted of them all. He was born around 808 CE into a Syriac-speaking Christian family. Syriac was the language of his prayers, his scriptures, his community. Arabic was the language of the streets and the empire. From the very beginning, Hunayn lived between tongues, and he developed a fascination for words. He collected them like others collected coins, memorizing synonyms, testing accents, marveling at how one idea could take different shapes depending on the language that carried it. His family's faith put him in contact with monasteries and church schools, places where books were copied and studied. In these libraries, echoes of Greek wisdom lingered, already translated into Syriac centuries before. But Syriac held only fragments, and even as a boy, Hunayn sensed that behind the veil of translation there was another, more luminous source. He wanted to touch it directly. When he was old enough, he traveled to Baghdad, the city of round walls and golden gates, hoping to study medicine. The capital was alive with scholarship. Hospitals, known as by Maristans, were busy not only treating the sick, but also training students. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, sponsored by caliphs and viziers, gathered manuscripts from across the known world. Here Greek philosophy, Persian statecraft, and Indian mathematics met Arabic inquiry. Into this ferment walked young Hunayn, eager and unafraid of questions. He became a pupil of Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the Nestorian Christian who served as court physician. Hunayn was famous, stern, and quick-tempered. Hunayn, however, would not sit silent. He challenged his teacher with questions, pressing for answers, hungry for understanding. The other students watched uneasily. Hunayn grew irritated. One day his patience broke, and Hunayn was driven out. It might have been the end of the boy's ambitions, for in Baghdad a failed student could easily vanish into obscurity. But Hunayn's spirit was not so easily crushed. Instead of surrendering, he made a vow to himself. If the masters of Baghdad would not feed his hunger for knowledge, he would seek it at its source. The source was Greek. It was in Greek that Galen, Hippocrates, Aristotle, and the philosophers of old had written their works. Syriac translations existed, but they were incomplete, sometimes corrupted, and often obscure. Hunayn set his heart on mastering Greek so thoroughly that no one could dismiss him again. He left Baghdad and traveled through lands where Greeks still lingered in schools and monasteries. The journey was long, and the discipline was hard. He learned the unfamiliar letters, memorized vocabulary lists, recited aloud until his tongue could shape the sound with ease. He copied manuscripts by hand, compared texts, and forced himself to read without relying on intermediaries. In time, he became fluent, more than fluent. He developed an intimacy with the language, hearing its rhythms and subtleties as if he had been born to it. Years later, when he returned to Baghdad, he carried not only manuscripts in his satchel, but also a power no other student possessed. He could speak directly with Galen across the centuries, without the fog of poor translations. The return changed everything. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, once his harsh master, could not help but recognize the brilliance of his former pupil. Reconciliation followed, and Hunayn's career truly began. He entered the House of Wisdom, not as a student, but as a master translator. The Abbasid caliphs, eager to gather the world's knowledge, valued men like him highly. There are stories of translators being paid in gold, measured by the weight of the books they produced, whether literal or exaggerated. The stories reflect the truth. Knowledge was precious, and the men who could unlock it were richly rewarded. Hunayn's method of translation was unlike anything seen before, where others translated word for word, producing clumsy and sometimes misleading texts. Hunayn sought meaning. He compared different copies of Greek manuscripts, corrected errors, and then rendered them into Syriac and Arabic with clarity and elegance. He explained his principles simply. The task of a translator was not to chain words together, but to transfer thought faithfully. Arabic, with its flexibility and beauty, became under his hand a vehicle for precise science. Through his translations, Galen spoke in Arabic as if he had been born to it. He did not work alone. His workshop in Baghdad functioned like a scholarly publishing house. His son Ishaq, his nephew Hubaysh, and other students copied, collated, and revised under his direction. Together, they translated hundreds of works. The bulk of Galen's medical corpus, treatises by Hippocrates, philosophical writings by Aristotle and Porphyry, all flowed into Syriac and Arabic through Hunayn's circle. He even compiled a catalog of Galen's works, distinguishing authentic texts from forgeries, guiding readers to what was genuine. Hunayn was not only a translator, he was also a physician, serving at the Abbasid court. That position carried both honor and danger. One story tells of Caliph al-Mutawakkil demanding Hunayn prepare poison. Hunayn refused, declaring that a physician's duty was to heal, never to harm. Whether the story is fact or legend, it reveals how he was remembered. As a man of principle, courageous even in the face of caliphal wrath, his ethical stance reinforced his reputation, and his integrity made his translations trustworthy. Scholars and physicians knew that the man who rendered Greek into Arabic did so with care, honesty, and commitment. Among his own writings, one stands out above all others: his treatise on the eye. Known as 10 Treatises on the Eye, it was the first systematic Arabic book on ophthalmology. In it, Hunayn described the anatomy of the eye, explained diseases of sight, and offered treatments. The book combined Greek medical theory with Hunayn's own observations, making a cornerstone of later Islamic and European ophthalmology. Alongside this, he composed primers for medical students, guides on fevers and diet, and lexicons that mapped drug names across Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Arabic. These lexicons were not mere lists. They were tools for physicians working in a multilingual world, where medicine known by one name in Persia might be called something else in Syria. By standardizing terms, Hunayn made medicine safer and more reliable. His work thrived because the Abbasid socio-economic environment supported it. The Bimaristans of Baghdad needed textbooks. The caliphs funded translations as a matter of policy. The paper mills, introduced from China, allowed copies to circulate widely. The markets were full of apothecaries and physicians who required accurate knowledge. Translation was not an isolated scholarly act. It was part of the living fabric of the city. Without this environment of wealth, patronage, and curiosity, Hunayn's genius might have remained a local talent, but with it, he became the architect of Arabic scientific language. The legacy of Hunayn's labor spread quickly. His translations became the foundation on which later giants like al-Razi and Ibn Sina built their encyclopedias. In hospitals across the Abbasid world, physicians studied Galen not in fractured fragments, but in Hunayn's clear Arabic. When later scholars disagreed with Galen, they did so in Hunayn's words. Even centuries later, when Latin scholars in Toledo and Salerno translated Arabic texts into Latin, it was often Hunayn's versions they rendered. Thus the chain of knowledge ran from Greece to Syriac, from Syriac to Arabic, and from Arabic to Latin. Europe's Renaissance physicians, studying anatomy and therapeutics, were unknowingly reading Galen through Hunayn's eyes. He lived until around 873 CE, serving the Abbasid court and guiding his workshop. His death closed a chapter, but did not end his influence. He left no monuments of stone, but his translations became bridges across time and culture. He had shown that knowledge does not survive by accident. It survives through method, through fidelity to meaning, and through courage. Hunayn ibn Ishaq remains not just a translator of words, but a translator of civilizations, a man who carried wisdom across languages and centuries. Picture him in his final years, bent over a manuscript, lips moving as he tests a phrase, scribes waiting with sharpened reeds to copy his words. Outside, merchants haggle. Boats slip along the Tigris. Ministers plot in the palace. He cannot control the city's currents, but with each line he renders faithfully, he throws another plank across the chasm of time. Many would walk across those bridges after him. Muslim, Christian, Jew, Arab, Latin, Persian. That is how a translator becomes immortal, not in monuments or dynasties, but in the survival of wisdom itself. In the years after Hunayn's return to Baghdad, the city itself had grown into something extraordinary. Founded barely a century before his birth, it was now the most dazzling metropolis of the Islamic world. Its round city walls enclosing palaces, mosques, gardens, and bustling markets. Scholars describe it as the navel of the world, for everything seemed to flow toward it. Gold, silk, spices, manuscripts, and men of talent. When Hunayn arrived again, carrying his mastery of Greek and the treasures of his journeys, he stepped into an environment eager for exactly what he could offer. The Abbasid caliphs had established the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, as both a library and a translation bureau. Though it began as a storehouse for Persian royal documents, it expanded into a universal repository of knowledge. Agents of the caliph scoured Byzantine lands for Greek manuscripts, purchased books from traders, or acquired them as spoils of diplomatic exchange. When these texts arrived in Baghdad, they often came damaged, incomplete, or written in unfamiliar scripts. It was the task of the translators to restore and transmit them. Hunayn quickly became the central figure in this endeavor. He organized his work with a discipline that reflected both his medical training and his linguistic brilliance. Unlike earlier translators, who often rendered Greek into Syriac first and then clumsily into Arabic, Hunayn preferred to approach the original directly. He would gather several copies of a manuscript, collate them, correct mistakes, and only then begin the act of translation. His goal was clarity, not ornamentation. He understood that physicians and philosophers who depended on these texts needed precision. A single mistranslated word in a medical recipe could mean the difference between cure and harm. Thus, Hunayn's insistence on accuracy was not merely scholarly pride. It was a matter of life and death. The atmosphere in Baghdad allowed this kind of work to thrive. The city's prosperity, built on trade and agriculture, supported a class of patrons who could afford to invest in books and learning. Paper, introduced from China a few decades earlier, revolutionized scholarship. Before paper, manuscripts were written on expensive parchment, limiting the spread of texts. With paper mills operating along the Tigris, books could be produced more cheaply and in greater numbers. Scribes worked tirelessly to copy texts, and the demand for translations grew ever greater. It was within this thriving economy of books that Hunayn's workshop flourished. Hunayn was not a solitary scholar, working in a dark corner. His house and study became a workshop buzzing with activity. His son, Ishaq ibn Hunayn, inherited his linguistic gifts and worked beside him. His nephew, Hubaysh, also became a devoted collaborator. Together with other disciples, they formed a network of translators, scribes, and editors. When manuscripts arrived at the House of Wisdom, they might be first examined by Hunayn, then distributed among his assistants. Hunayn would dictate corrections, review drafts, and ensure the final version carried a stamped precision. Through this method, vast portions of Greek science and medicine entered Arabic. Galen, the great physician of the Roman world, had written prolifically, producing hundreds of treatises. Before Hunayn, only fragments were available in Syriac. After Hunayn, the Abbasid world had access to nearly the entire Galenic corpus. Hippocrates, too, was rendered into clear Arabic. Aristotle's logical works, as well as commentaries by later Greek thinkers, became accessible. Philosophical schools that had once been confined to distant academies in Athens or Alexandria now lived again in the heart of Baghdad. Hunayn did more than translate. He annotated, explained, and sometimes corrected. He was not shy about identifying spurious works falsely attributed to Galen. He composed a catalog, known as Risala, that listed Galen's authentic writings, marking those he considered doubtful. This critical approach was new. In an age when the mere possession of a manuscript could bestow prestige, Hunayn dared to judge the reliability of texts. By doing so, he gave scholars tools to navigate the sea of inherited writings with greater confidence. Yet Hunayn was not only the servant of ancient wisdom, he was also an interpreter. His own writings, especially his medical treatises, reveal a man deeply engaged with the problems of health. His 10 treatises on the eye was groundbreaking, not only because it was the first systematic study of ophthalmology in Arabic, but also because it synthesized knowledge from Galen with Hunayn's own clinical experience. He described the anatomy of the eye, the optic nerve, the humors that refracted light, and the diseases that could strike vision. His descriptions guided physicians for centuries and laid the groundwork for later advances by Islamic and European doctors alike. Beyond ophthalmology, Hunayn also wrote educational manuals for medical students. These works organized diseases and treatments in systematic fashion, turning the scattered wisdom of Greek texts into coherent curricula. He also compiled lexicons that matched medical terms across Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Arabic in the multilingual world of the Abbasid Empire. Such tools were invaluable. A physician trained in one region might encounter a drug under a different name in another. Hunayn's lexicons ensured that knowledge traveled as smoothly as the merchants who carried medicines along the caravan routes. The respect Hunayn enjoyed at the Abbasid court was immense, but it came with risks. The caliphs often demanded loyalty, and the position of court physician could be perilous. Tales circulated that al-Mutawakkil, known for his volatile temper, once ordered Hunayn to prepare poison. Hunayn refused, arguing that his duty was to heal, not to kill. Though the details of the story are debated, its survival reflects how Hunayn was remembered, as a man of integrity who placed his profession above fear. In an empire where scholars sometimes bent their pens to please rulers, Hunayn stood firm. The economic and political environment of Baghdad magnified his influence. The city was not just a place of wealth, but also of competition. Scholars, poets, and theologians vied for patronage. In this bustling marketplace of intellect, Hunayn's translations offered something unique: access to the wisdom of the ancients. Caliphs could boast of their libraries, viziers could fund translations to enhance their prestige, and physicians could strengthen their practice with reliable texts. Hunayn's work thus became woven into the very fabric of Abbasid society, both culturally and economically. In the evenings, after the day's work of translating and teaching, one imagines Hunayn in his home surrounded by books and students, dictating a passage from Galen, pausing to explain a tricky term, and testing different Arabic renderings until he was satisfied. He knew that his work was not ephemeral. Each phrase he chose would echo through hospitals and schools, shaping the way future generations thought about health, philosophy, and science. His life was a testimony to the idea that translation is not mere imitation, but creation. For in carrying thought from one language to another, he was building new intellectual worlds. By the middle of the 9th century, Hunayn ibn Ishaq had become a legend in his own time. His name was synonymous with precision, his translations became standard references, and his ethical stance elevated him above mere court service. He was not a wealthy merchant or a powerful general, yet his influence reached further than theirs. For while armies conquered lands and merchants traded goods, Hunayn conquered ignorance and traded in wisdom, the rarest and most enduring currency of them all. Hunayn's reputation, though great, did not shield him from the storms of Abbasid politics. Baghdad was a city of brilliance, but it was also a city of intrigue. Ministers rose and fell with dizzying speed. Caliphs shifted between tolerance and suspicion, and scholars who lived by their pens could just as easily die by them. Hunayn, as a court physician and a man trusted with precious knowledge, walked a narrow path between service and survival. One of the stories most often told about him comes from the reign of al-Mutawakkil. The caliph was infamous for his unpredictability, sometimes generous to scholars, other times cruel. According to chroniclers, he once ordered Hunayn to prepare poison for a political enemy. Hunayn refused flatly. He argued that a physician's duty was to preserve life, not to take it, and he would rather risk his own safety than break the oath of his profession. In a court where refusal often meant death, this act was astonishing. Some versions of the tale claim that al-Mutawakkil imprisoned him for a time, others that he punished him severely before relenting. Whatever the exact details, the story circulated widely, shaping Hunayn's legacy as a physician of conscience. These ethical stances were not mere legends. They were embedded in the very way Hunayn approached his work. To him, a mistranslation was not an innocent mistake. It was a betrayal of truth. He trained his students to copy with discipline, to collate multiple manuscripts, and to remain faithful to meaning rather than words. This discipline reflected not only scholarly rigor, but also moral seriousness. For Hunayn, words were instruments of healing, just as surely as medicines were. A wrong word could wound as deeply as a wrong drug. But Hunayn's rise to fame also attracted envy. Other translators and physicians competed for influence at court, and rumors sometimes swirled around him. Some accused him of favoring his Christian co-religionists in appointments. Others whispered that he withheld knowledge for his own circle. Yet his translation spoke louder than his enemies. Every hospital that used his texts, every student who learned medicine through his Arabic Galen, became a silent witness to his importance. Even those who disliked him depended on his work. Hunayn's intellectual environment was not only medical. The 9th century was also an age of fierce theological debates. The Mutazilites, with their rationalist theology, had once enjoyed caliphal support but fell out of favor. Traditionalist scholars grew stronger. Philosophy, imported from Greek sources, often stirred suspicion among conservative jurists. Hunayn himself was a Christian in a Muslim empire, and while Christians had long served in administration and medicine, their presence was sometimes contested. Yet Hunayn navigated this delicate terrain with remarkable skill. He kept his focus on medicine and translation, steering clear of direct involvement in theological disputes, while still earning the trust of Muslim patrons. His Christian identity, far from being a hindrance, in some ways gave him a special role. He was seen as a neutral carrier of Greek knowledge, not aligned with any particular Muslim sect. The intellectual fruits of his labor began to spread beyond Baghdad. As copies of his translations multiplied, they reached other centers of learning: Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba. Physicians in distant lands opened his Arabic versions of Galen and Hippocrates and studied them as if they were originals. His son, Ishaq ibn Hunayn, carried on the work, especially in philosophy, translating Aristotle's metaphysics and Nicomachean ethics into Arabic. Thus Hunayn's workshop became not just a family business, but a dynasty of knowledge. What made Hunayn's translation so enduring was their balance of fidelity and beauty. Arabic, in his hands, was not clumsy but supple. He chose terms that conveyed the exact force of Greek ideas without distorting them. Sometimes he even coined new words, enriching Arabic scientific vocabulary. Later philosophers like al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd would draw upon his vocabulary to build vast systems of thought. Without Hunayn's careful groundwork, their edifices might have lacked a foundation. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, Europe was slowly stirring. In the 10th and 11th centuries, when Toledo and other cities of Spain became sites of translation from Arabic into Latin, it was often Hunayn's text that lay at the heart of the process. Gerard of Cremona, one of the greatest Latin translators, relied heavily on Arabic Galen. Arabic Galen that was, in fact, Hunayn's Galen. Thus the wisdom of Greece, refracted through Syriac and Arabic, re-entered Europe not as a pure echo, but as a transformed voice. Hunayn's fingerprints were invisible, but everywhere. Medieval European medicine, until the Renaissance, rested on his labors. But what of Hunayn himself, the man behind the manuscripts? Accounts describe him as patient and diligent, with a piercing intellect. He was known to memorize long passages, to test words aloud, to demand perfection from his scribes. Some students complained of his strictness, but many revered him. His household was both a family and a school, his table surrounded by young men eager to learn the craft of translation. In his later years, when his fame was secure, he devoted more time to writing original works. His book of the 10 treatises on the eye remained a reference point for centuries. He also wrote on fevers, on diet, and on the preparation of medicines, always with clarity and precision. The socio-economic conditions of Baghdad continued to shape his work. The city's prosperity fueled the demand for physicians and books, but political instability often threatened to undo these gains. Caliphs were assassinated, viziers plotted, armies mutinied. Each new regime brought uncertainty. For a scholar like Hunayn, whose livelihood depended on patronage, this volatility was dangerous. Yet he weathered these storms, partly through his indispensable skill and partly through his refusal to be drawn into factional politics. He was too valuable to lose, too honest to replace easily. Hunayn's death around 873 CE marked the end of an era. By then, he had translated more than 100 works, trained a generation of students, and left behind a body of original writings that would guide medicine for centuries. His passing was mourned not only by his family, but by the entire scholarly community of Baghdad. Yet his influence did not die with him. Through the circulation of his books, he continued to speak to students in Cairo, Cordoba, Salerno, and Paris. He became, in the words of later historians, the Sheikh of Translators, a title that captured both his mastery and his authority. Looking back, Hunayn's life reveals a profound power of translation. He did not invent medicine, nor did he conquer new lands. His genius was in carrying the wisdom of one world into another with fidelity and grace. He bridged Greek, Syriac, Arabic, and, indirectly, Latin. He allowed Galen to speak to Avicenna, and Avicenna to speak to Aquinas. Without him, the chain of knowledge might have broken. With him, it endured. In the quiet of his study, when he bent over a manuscript and searched for the right Arabic word to mirror a Greek concept, Hunayn could not have known how far his words would travel. Yet travel they did, across deserts and seas, across centuries and cultures. His life reminds us that knowledge survives not only through discovery, but through care, the care of those who copy, translate, and preserve. Hunayn ibn Ishaq was such a guardian, and because of him, the wisdom of the ancients still whispers in our libraries today. Hunayn's passing in 873 CE did not silence him. In truth, it amplified his voice. The Abbasid court may have lost its trusted physician and translator, but Baghdad and the wider Islamic world continued to breathe with the life he had poured into his books. His translations became part of the bloodstream of knowledge, circulating through schools, hospitals, and libraries long after his body returned to the earth. In the decade that followed, the Islamic Golden Age reached even greater heights, and Hunayn's influence was everywhere. Al-Razi, the brilliant Persian physician known in the West as Rhazes, composed his encyclopedic comprehensive book on medicine. Ibn Sina, the polymath of Bukhara, later called Avicenna in Europe, wrote his canon of medicine, which would become the most authoritative medical text for centuries. Both of these giants built their systems on Galen and Hippocrates, but their access to Galen was through Hunayn's Arabic. When Avicenna disagreed with Galen, he was disagreeing with Galen as rendered by Hunayn. Thus, even when invisible, Hunayn shaped the debate. He was a quiet architect behind the masterpieces. Hospitals, or bimaristans, multiplied across the Abbasid realm. In their libraries, physicians studied Hunayn's translations. In their wards, they applied treatments described in his Arabic Galen. In their classrooms, they read his 10 treatises on the eye. Students who never knew his name nonetheless learned through his words. The medical curriculum of the Islamic world, from Cairo to Cordoba, bore his mark. The Arabic medical language he had crafted became the common tongue of doctors for centuries. But Hunayn's impact did not stop at the borders of the Islamic world. In the 11th and 12th centuries, as Europe began to reawaken intellectually, scholars turned to Arabic as a source of lost knowledge. Cities like Toledo in Spain, newly taken from Muslim rule, became translation centers. There, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars sat side by side, rendering Arabic texts into Latin. Among the works they translated were Hunayn's Galen, Hunayn's Hippocrates, Hunayn's Aristotle. Thus, the words that had once crossed from Greek into Syriac, from Syriac into Arabic, now leapt into Latin. In Salerno, the first great medical school of medieval Europe, students pored over Latin Galen and Hippocrates, texts that carried Hunayn's imprint. Gerard of Cremona, one of the most prolific translators of Toledo, rendered countless Arabic works into Latin, many of them traced back to Hunayn. Through these channels, Europe received not only Greek wisdom, but also Hunayn's methods, his clarity, his choice of words. Without Hunayn, the Renaissance revival of classical medicine would have lacked its vital spark. The irony is that Hunayn himself never knew of this European legacy. His world was bounded by Baghdad and the Abbasid court, by the desert routes of manuscripts, by the theological disputes of his time. He could not have imagined that centuries later, in Paris or Bologna, students would argue over passages that he had once wrestled into Arabic. He could not have known that European scholars would call him Johannius, Latinizing his name, and revere him as an authority in his own right. Yet that was the fate of his words, to wander further than he ever traveled, to speak to ears he never dreamed of. Hunayn's story also reminds us of the fragility of knowledge. The Abbasid Caliphate itself eventually fractured. Baghdad was sacked by the Mongols in 1258, its libraries destroyed, its scholars killed or scattered. But by then, Hunayn's translations had already spread too far to be lost. They had crossed into Cairo, Damascus, Cordoba, and beyond into Europe. His bridges of language endured even when empires fell. The very act of translation had preserved them against the fires of war. His influence extended beyond medicine. Philosophers like al-Kindi, al-Farabi, and Ibn Rushd engaged deeply with Greek philosophy, often through Hunayn's translations. When Latin Europe rediscovered Aristotle, it was often through Hunayn's Arabic versions or those of his son, Ishaq. In this way, Hunayn was not only a physician's guide, but also a philosopher's gatekeeper. The Aristotelian tradition that shaped medieval scholasticism in Europe carried Hunayn's fingerprints. The socioeconomic fabric that had once nurtured his work also reveals something about the endurance of culture. Translation required patronage, and the Abbasid caliphs provided it. But it also required infrastructure, paper mills, book markets, trained scribes. Hunayn's genius flourished not in isolation, but in an ecosystem of wealth, curiosity, and cosmopolitanism. That is why his legacy could not be erased by a single war or ruler. It was too deeply rooted in the fabric of society, in the countless copies of his texts that circulated far beyond Baghdad. And yet, Hunayn remains in some ways an unsung hero. To many, the names of Avicenna or Galen are familiar, but Hunayn is less well known. Perhaps this is because translators rarely claim the spotlight. They stand behind the stage, moving others' words into new voices. But in Hunayn's case, translation was not passive. It was active, creative, interpretive. He did not merely echo Greek thought. He transformed it, reshaped it, and gave it new life in Arabic. He was both midwife and surgeon to ideas, ensuring their safe passage into new worlds. If we were to imagine Hunayn's final legacy, it would not be in a single book or a single discovery, but in the web of knowledge he preserved. Without him, the chain linking Hippocrates to Avicenna to Galen to Renaissance Europe might have snapped. With him, it held firm. He was a link, yes, but a golden one, polished by diligence, strengthened by ethics, and burnished by time. In reflecting on Hunayn's life, one cannot help but see a lesson for our own age. We live in a world where information travels faster than ever, yet the challenge of understanding across languages and cultures remains. Hunayn shows us that translation is more than technical. It is moral. To carry an idea from one language to another is to carry responsibility. It demands fidelity, care, and sometimes courage. Hunayn risked caliphal wrath rather than poison his craft. He endured exile and hardship rather than surrender his hunger for learning. In doing so, he proved that the true physician heals not only bodies but civilizations. Hunayn ibn Ishaq's biography is thus not only the story of a translator or physician, but the story of a bridge builder. He built bridges between Syriac and Arabic, between Greek and Latin, between antiquity and the Middle Ages, between the Abbasid court and the European Renaissance. These bridges were not of stone or steel. They were of ink and paper, fragile yet enduring. 1,000 years later, we still walk across them whenever we study medicine, philosophy, or science that traces back to the ancients. And so, when we close our eyes and picture Hunayn, we might see him not as a court physician or a scholar hunched over manuscripts, but as a quiet builder by a river. Around him flow the waters of history, threatening to sweep away the treasures of the past. With steady hands, he lays planks of translation across the torrent. Behind him stand the ancients, their words ready to cross. Before him stretch the future generations, waiting to receive them. Between them, Hunayn stands, Humble yet resolute, a man who made the wisdom of one world the inheritance of another. That is his true monument. Not the walls of Baghdad, not the palaces of the caliphs, not the dynasties that rose and fell, but the enduring survival of knowledge. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the physician, the translator, the guardian of wisdom, still speaks to us, not through the voice of power, but through the whisper of words that never died.